Good morning, everybody. I am up early, which you all know how much I do not like to do that anymore. This is Raven, and this is an interview that I have been looking forward to. I arranged it the minute that I could. We are about to blow your mind. I have a guest with me that I am very anxious to share with you, Colonel Towner-Watkins, and we are going to give you some revelations about a project named Gladio. Colonel, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
I have no idea where you want to start, but I figure you're the guest, and I will follow your lead.
Okay, so the first place I'd like to start is kind of a definition of terminology. I was indicating to you earlier, I like to start from a frame of reference. To avoid bickering among responsible parties, I use a term when I'm discussing Operation Gladio called the International Syndicate. The International Syndicate, in my definition, is everybody that's at the head of the snake. And the multiple, like the octopus, there's multiple heads, and I refer to them collectively as the International Syndicate. The members of the International Syndicate could be heads of state, intel agencies, foreign governments at large.
Yes.
It's just a conglomerate. The heads of religions, they're all in this international syndicate. So when I refer to the international syndicate, that's what I'm talking about. Because oftentimes when you get to a particular subject and you talk about this person's, for example, when I first started digging into Operation Gladio, there's a huge element of Jewish people that were in Germany at the time of World War II in the lead up to that. And the reason why the fact that they were Jewish and maintained ownership of companies in the middle of an annihilation of fellow Jewish people, like, the George Soroses of the world, is very important to call out what religion they are. The same thing with Catholicism. When you find out that in canon law, it is forbidden for you to be a Mason, and yet the Vatican is full of them, you cannot make the conversation understandable and the significance of it without mentioning religion. But the mentioning of religion oftentimes gets people dander up. And so everybody is fair game, and I only mention the religions when it's relevant to the conversation.
Yes, ma'am. But now, here's my thing. Folks that are listening to me, you have heard me talk about the Jesuit connections. You have heard me talk about the Ashkenazi connections, the Zionist connections, the direct Catholic connections, whether it be the bishops or the archbishops or the cardinals. There are a lot of connections in here. Then we go to Soros and we go to Rothschilds and these individuals that are in the corporate side. What the Colonel's trying to explain to you all is by calling it a syndicate, she's referring to the same thing that I'm always referred to as the global totalitarian state, okay?
Exactly.
This is a group of individuals and organizations and companies that are all part of a syndicate, which is a fantastic word because syndicate generally entails the fact that they're doing something illegal or something that's not good for us.
And that's the whole point. It's a criminal enterprise. So there is no better word to use than syndicate. And it's international because when you call it a state, it's as if it's a official entity. It is not. It is a syndicate that works in coordination with each other, and every single aspect of it is coordinated. So I also want to define Operation Gladio. So Operation Gladio is an umbrella term that was used to describe the operation of this entity inside of Europe. It is a global operation, and specifically when they were doing the Gladio type operations in South America, it went by the name of Operation Condor. But just think of that as a sub-entity to the overarching Gladio. I have read some authors that refer to it as Compass Rose, and that was a terminology used inside of NATO. And if you look at the NATO seal and you look at the CIA seal, there is a compass rose on both, which is ironic because Gladio is ran by the CIA and NATO. So symbolism will be their downfall is a real thing. It's also referred to as stay behind units. It's also referred to as the strategy of tension, and it's also referred to specifically in Italy as the years of lead. So meaning there was a lot of bullets flying around. So those are all the same operation. And I also want to introduce a new terminology that I have come to appreciate, the direct connection. So because Gladio was set up under the guise of, after World War II, of fighting communism, there is a specific use of the word anti-communist or anti-communism where you find it in Anti-Communist League and agendas at the UN back in that day, because remember the UN had just been created as well. Every effort that has been from the late 1940s to the early 1970s at the height of the anti-communist movement is basically a code word for Gladio operations. It was the excuse they used to kill millions of people.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that I want to tie in here very quickly is that Operation Condor, most people my age would be familiar with because of all the things with the Sandinistas and
exactly.
Colonel Ollie North with the guns, the Iran-Contra deal. So those would be your Condor programs. Now, the other thing that folks, I want to make sure that you heard, it's called the Stay Behind or tension programs. When you have stay behind units, and you've heard this, like very good example recently, Syria and Jordan, stay behind units. Iraq, stay behind units. You need to understand that this fits into the Gladio umbrella of operations. A lot of people wouldn't have made that connection both past and present, and I wanted to make sure it was there.
That's excellent because we will get to both Syria and Iraq.
Nice.
So, and I have some personal experience in northern Iraq. I was deployed there in the 90s. So what happens with just that little bit of information requires you to go back, as you just pointed out, and you almost have to reread everything that you've ever read, because you will realize that in books that you've read, like I bought 2 years ago, Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail, and I read that book 2 years ago. I didn't know anything about Operation Gladio at the time. Once I discovered Operation Gladio about 6 months ago, I went back and we did a Rumble channel book review of Whitney Webb's entire book, 2 volumes, as how it relates to Operation Gladio. And it perfectly overlays everything, because blackmail is part of Operation Gladio. And the same players, Paul Helliwell, William Colby, William Casey, the name. So I started building a relational chart that my daughter and I are working on that will depict the exact overlays of all of these players and the operations that they were tied to, because it's an identical match. And that's how I validate if we're on the right track. So let me talk just a little bit about how Stay Behind units came about.
There we go.
In pre-World War II history, we had the Boer Wars, BOER, in the 1899 to 1902 time frame. There were 2 wars. They were in South Africa, and Boers were farmers that had long ago had some immigrants embed themselves, and they were a very peaceful farming integrated no problems racially, nothing.
Yes.
So, unfortunately for them, they discovered gold and then eventually diamonds.
Yes.
On the land that they were farming. Well, England and the powers to be in the international syndicate got wind of that because Cecil Rhodes, who we will get to in a minute, was nearby in what eventually became known as Rhodesia.
Yes.
Named after him. So they got wind that gold had been discovered there. So they bring in an overwhelming force into the Boer areas to take it over from. They were just going to steal those resources. Well, the Boers created stay-behind units. They went in and buried weapons and communication, whatever they were using for communication capability, and explosives that they could get a hold of into these stay-behind units. And they hid themselves. And as the British came rushing past them, they got caught in the crossfire of the Boers who had stayed in place. And basically, the Boers rose up from these stay-behind units and annihilated them. They were like 20-1 in a ratio of fighting forces, but the British got annihilated. And guess who was reporting on all of this activity? A very young William Churchill.
Wow.
Did you even know he was a journalist?
I had no idea.
He was. And he was there and captured all of it. So he goes back, obviously. He becomes basically what we would call the Secretary of Commerce in the UK. And then he obviously becomes the Prime Minister. So he takes that knowledge and he begins as the Secretary of Commerce in all of the British colonies of implementing basically kind of a stay-behind theory. He starts preaching this because he was amazed at how well it worked. So then what happens is the Second Boer War, the British brings in like 200-1 and just massively massacre all the Boers. And when I say all the Boers, I mean all the Boers. They rounded up women and children and invalid people from their first war in concentration camps. British authorities were the first use of concentration camps in the world. Yes. And they did it in South Africa. So you now have the concept of stay-behind units thoroughly documented for the first time. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you have Rhodes and a guy by the name of Oswald and all of these guys setting up the London School of Economics, the Balfour Agreement, the League of Nations, and the British Round Table. From the British Round Table, you end up with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, and all of Oxford, and we end up with the CFR. Yes. These are subsets of the British Round Table. And the reason why I mention that is because the British Round Table's goal was, and they say it very blatantly and very honestly, one world government. And the one world government is going to be managed by the British Round Table. There's going to be 5 seats at the table. They are going to divide the world up in basically what looks like in our military COCOMs, combatant commanders. And there's going to be a seat for the Americas, and they call that PAN, P-A-N, Pan America. There's going to be a Pan Europe seat. There's going to be a Pan Asia and a Pan British Empire. Now, at one point, Germany, who was the strongest country within Europe, did not want the British Empire to have a seat. They wanted there to be one Europe, and they wanted to be in charge of it. And that's where you get all of the people where they start talking about the theories of Prussiagate and the emergence of the German-dominated. And the other thing I want to point out is when they defined these COCOMs, they were very specific. The European COCOM was going to go to the Ural Mountains, which is half of Russia, which is why they will not leave Russia alone. They believe that the Russia to the Ural Mountains is actually Europe, and Russia cannot exist. And that explains this fascination and fetish they have with Putin and Russia in general.
Well, you know, they've been trying to eliminate the Rus people ever since they killed the Tsar. So it's been an ongoing.
This is the time frame when they're setting this up at the British Roundtable in the late 1800s, where they were developing the plans to eliminate all of the European royalty. Because what they can't have is a culture that's cohesive. Royal monarchs, despite their faults, people were loyal to the monarchs. You cannot implement a one world government with monarchs. It is diabolically in opposition to each other.
Yes, but you know, to point, you know, they're talking about going to the Urals with the European, pan-Europe, and folks just don't make the connections. 100 years, 120 years is a hard thing for people to grasp, but the elimination of the Tsar and the takeover through communism in Russia was just one stage.
Correct. And we'll get to the communist part in a minute. All right. So I want to set the table, and they believe that the east of the Urals belonged to Asia. So that was going to be the split of that COCOM, if you will. So you will notice initially there was not a pan-Arabic, and there was not a pan-Africa, because they were very specific in thinking that both Arabic and Africa were subhumans. They later decided they were going to set up a pan-Arabic because of oil, and that there was going to be way too much turmoil. It is my belief, I do not have any documentation, and I will tell you when I'm speculating. It is my belief that's the reason why Turkey is in NATO. There is no other logical reason Turkey is in NATO, being the only Muslim country. However, Turkey, as you all know, was the final home of the caliphate, and it is their belief that if they reactivate the caliphate under a captured entity like Turkey, that they will control all of the resources in the Arabian Peninsula. So that kind of goes together, but that is speculation. But they did modify their document, if you will, to include a pan-Arabic. And that's the reason why the British created the Mahe of Egypt. And that is a Gladio operation as well. It is the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, which you will find out once you start researching Gladio. Every known terror organization has a Gladio affiliation. Yes. So the Mahe of Egypt created the Muslim Brotherhood in order to affect Middle East terrorism. And that was kind of a back burner, if you will, as long as they had the Communist Club. They could use the anti-communist, and as soon as that went away in 1991, what happened? We went to war in 1991 and created the Arabic, the radical Muslim boogeyman, because you have to have a boogeyman in order to terrorize people. And it is no coincidence that we went to war in 1991 with a Arabic country at the same time that we collapsed the big bully communists. And keep in mind that during the 70s, we are growing a new communist boogeyman in China when Richard Nixon goes over there. So it's all timing.
And folks, I think I'll insert here so that people understand. If you haven't seen Agenda 2063, that is their goal for Africa. Something that she just brought up, the collapse of Russia in 89 to 91 was offset by Nixon and specifically Kissinger and Brzezinski, along with Chase Bank, setting up the communists in Russia to become in China to become a power. That had been in the works since Rockefeller had been over there in the early 1900s and helped Mao take over.
That's the perfect transition. Thank you for adding that, because Anthony Sutton wrote a trilogy about the Bolshevik Revolution, the FDR, and Hitler. And he makes the case that a building in New York City called 120 Broadway was the birthplace of communism, fascism, and FDR.
Yes.
So every one of those three things are tied to the creation of communism. It was bought and paid for by London and 120 Broadway. 120 Broadway, you may recognize, is the home to the Fed. It was home to Rockefeller at the time. It was home to multiple entities that were owned by the Rothschilds. It was the first place that FDR worked. So law firms that were held
120, if you've listened to my other podcasts, the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, Rockefeller Foundation, Chase Morgan, FDR, and all the Delanos. The Rockefellers themselves personally, Kellogg, Brown, and Root. I can go through all the agencies that were involved in World War II, but Kellogg, Brown, and Root is the big one because that would be Prescott Bush.
Yes.
I wanted to give you context here because what she's trying to tell you connects into all these other spider webs.
Exactly.
I will shut up.
So you have please. I mean, this is turning out perfect. So you have this group that created and funded communism, and here's how I tie in the international syndicate at this point because this is critical to understand. Their first effort was to go in under the Bolshevik Revolution. Keep in mind the Bolsheviks were primarily Jewish, and the reason why I mention this is because all religions are used.
Yes.
So you have this Bolshevik Revolution that takes out the Tsar. You have Lenin and Trotsky, who are the key people at this point. Lenin was harbored in London. He spent years there being paid for by the city of London, kept in the city of London, transited Germany on his way into Russia. You have the Trotsky, who lived in New York City under the tutelage of the guys at 120 Broadway. He was kept there for years. He was fed. He was in a house in the early 1900s. At the time, none of us had telephones or refrigerators, in an apartment with a telephone and a refrigerator.
Yes.
He was snuck out with a State Department issued visa to travel to Russia via Canada. He was snuck in through the neutral Sweden into Russia at the perfect time to basically create communism. Immediately, you have a Red Cross mission that goes with GE representatives, with the railroad representatives, with all of the people that you just mentioned from 120 Broadway, under the guise of a Red Cross mission into Russia, that basically, in the aftermath of hundreds of thousands of dead bodies laying on the streets, began building railroads and electrifying Russia under the Soviet communist concept. Now, why, if they're our enemy, would you go in and build out the entire frickin' infrastructure?
Exactly.
Well, you do that because you need them as an enemy, because of what we're going to discuss in a few minutes. Because now you transition that entire apparatus over to create Hitler. They funded Hitler when he tried to overthrow the Austrian government while he was in jail. The same group. There's cables of money transfers that Sutton there's multiple videos of him talking about. In his books, he has all of the State Department cables transferring money over to Hitler and paying for the scribe that they had, like a secretary while he was in prison, so he can write Mein Kampf, all of this. So he's another bought and paid for guy. You can argue, but there's evidence that says this, and it's all in the money.
Well, and in case you didn't know, Adolf Hitler's real name was Pruis. and his mother worked for the Rothschilds. So
correct. Yeah, there's a definite reason they picked him. So I have a quote here from R.E. McMaster that he wrote in a book called The Reaper. Here's the quote. The goal of international communism is not to destroy Western international debt capitalism. The goal of international communism is to enslave mankind at the behest of Western international debt communism.
Mm-hmm.
And that literally could be stamped in the round table goal of a 150-year operation. That is literally why they created communism.
Well, now, see, you just hit something that most people completely miss. And they say, well, this conspiracy, well, first of all, it only takes two people to make a plan. But the other thing is there's like, how did they do this over this long period of time? And I keep trying to explain to folks that they have a 100, a 150, and a 200-year plan that they wrote out in the 1890s.
So you realize that they realized this could not be done with kinetic force.
Mm-hmm.
They would not have spent all of the time and effort psychologically in the exploration of minds and control of people, because it's never been about just taking control of physical land. This has been about taking control of humanity.
Yes.
And the first thing that you have to do is be able to create enough chaos in the world in order for you to fund launder money to fund these studies to understand how to psychologically control. Because if you're going to have 100 or a couple hundred people control the entire world, you have to be able to do that both physically and mentally.
Yes.
They did not have the technology at the time to be able to control people mentally. So they spent decades with the whole eugenicist movement and all of that other stuff, because they have to be able to control people psychologically.
Well, and I got my degree in humanities, and when I did my humanities degree, it was philosophy, sociology, and psychology, plus archaeology and anthropology. But my thing is, sociology is the control of masses and the control and understanding of the masses. Psychology is the individual psyche, and they spent decades. We can go back to propaganda. I mean, for example, Edward Bernays' propaganda.
Exactly.
Decades figuring out a way to manipulate not just individuals like myself, because trust me, if they wanted to directly manipulate me, they would find the one trigger that they needed to use, and they would use it. And masses, as in whole societies, whole nations, whole regions. And they've been doing this ever since Bernays and his uncle, Freud. They have been working at sociology and psychology as a way to manipulate the masses. Very good example, folks. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because ever since Kennedy ran for office, they have had a whole busload of psychologists and sociologists watching the speeches. And they tweak speeches for candidates and for sales, marketing. They tweak these things based on the reactions of people. They have learned this is a known science now.
That is absolutely correct. 100%. So you realize that, and I want to throw in this because my husband, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, has to listen to me talk about all of the stuff that I read every day. And he has a very, he's an electrical contractor. He spent 30 years owning his own business and is very logically minded. So after hearing for about 4 months talk extensively about Operation Gladio, he wakes up one day and he goes, "Hey, do you remember that show called Get Smart?" And I'm like, "Of course I do." And he goes, "Do you know what those two organizations were called?" And I'm like, "No." And he goes, "Chaos and Control."
Yes.
He said, chaos was the bad guy and control was the good guy. And I'm looking at him and I went, son of a gun.
Yes.
They're telling you exactly what they're doing. They create chaos, i.e., strategy of tension, for the purpose of controlling us.
Yep.
And they name the name of the comedy "Get Smart." Like they're daring you to realize you are being controlled by the chaos, and you dang sure better get smart.
Exactly. Well, and it goes back to here's my philosophy. It goes back to the Hegelian dialectic: problem, reaction, solution. And people give David Icke
exactly right.
But in spite of some of the things that he and I differentiate on, he has been spot on for 30 plus years.
Correct. And it delves right into the control. That is exactly how they control us, is by the chaos. Their chaos machine is called Operation Gladio.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you have the countries. So now we're up to like around the World War I time frame. And you transition through the World War I, and you have people like what's his name? Heydrich Slat, that was the banker for Hitler, and he goes around in the interim war time frame because supposedly Germany was in dire straits with the Weimar Republic, and that's supposedly what brought Hitler into being. In actuality, the Slat banker guy had already went to all of the European powers and that were the Allies in World War I, and had convinced them that he had a way of setting up to fix the inflation issue, which basically he kind of created commodity groups and got loans based on, or their currency based on these commodity groups, which basically cured the inflation. The whole reason that the reparations were levied was to create the Bank of International Settlements.
Yes.
And that's going to become important in a minute. The Bank of International Settlements, in its creation, was supposedly created to handle the reparation payments. However, in the past, when they had like the war between France and England and Germany and other entities, they did that with the setting up of trusts. So they had a mechanism for reparations. But the long-term use of the Bank of International Settlements was going to be to steal everyone's gold. So the Bank of International Settlements was set up, and people that were Americans, and Alan Dulles' OSS office was set up right down the street from the Bank of International Settlements, and that was on purpose, in Switzerland. So you have the Bank of International Settlements. Everybody was required that's going to get reparations or to give reparations was required to donate all of these massive amounts of gold. And when World War II, and by the way, once it was established, literally the next payment of reparations, the reparations were forgiven by all of the Allies. The only reason
that's important to bring up.
Yes. They used it as a justification to create a World Bank. It was the first World Bank, not to be confused with the actual World Bank, but it was the first World Bank. And the only reason it was set up was a camouflage for what's going to happen next.
Yeah, to hoard a stockpile of gold.
Yes. What happened next is World War II. So World War II, when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and Romania, all of these people had been in the Bank of International Settlements. And all Hitler did was pick up the phone and say, well, Slats did it, pick up the phone and say, move their gold to Germany's accounts.
Yes.
There was no formal moving of gold. It was all in the Bank of International Settlements. It was all done by a ledger. So at the end of the day, Germany ended up with all of that gold. Well, at the end of World War II, the Gladio operation in general basically ended up with all of that gold.
Yes.
Okay. So now we move on to, oh, and also I need to point out here the international syndicate's role in all of this. So what you find is every time you go to war, whether it's an internal coup, internal meaning CIA, make it look like it happened on the internal side,
yes.
Or you actually wage war against a country, these industrialists, the industrialist arm of the international syndicate swoops in. Now, the World War II had so many dynamics when it came to the industrial eventual ownership of the countries outside of Germany, like Poland and Hungary, and they were never able to shake off basically the international syndicate's ownership. And the reason why I bring this up, because Russia becomes very important in this again, because in 1991, have you covered with everybody the Magnitsky?
No.
Okay, so in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was a mad rush, as there always is when these Gladio things happen because of the international syndicate. There was a mad rush of the industrialists to go in and buy up all of the state-owned entities.
Yes.
Well, Broward, the guy that was at the heart, Bill Broward, of, and his family is communist, Marxist, fascist from the word go.
Yes.
So he was the quote-unquote hedge fund investor face of the international syndicate's feet on the ground in Russia. He was not there to help Russia. He was there to steal all of their resources. Magnitsky was his guy inside of the Russian government, helping him do it. Well, Magnitsky ends up dead.
Yes.
Putin, after this, ends up, because being in the KGB, Putin knew exactly what was going on, and he was going to stop it. So Magnitsky ends up dead. They come back over to the United States, Broward, and lies to the American public, and they get the Magnitsky Act passed, which basically puts forever sanctions on Russia, which was all bullshit.
Absolutely.
And Putin, the reason why he is so popular in Russia, Putin saved Russia from the rape and pillage of the international syndicate in 1990s by throwing Bill Broward and his international syndicate clan out of Russia and protecting their people.
I want to go backwards just a little bit. First of all, the Bank of International Settlements had two faces, but we need to point out that the Warburgs and the Schiffs were behind it at the behest of Rockefeller, okay? That's the first thing. And the same thing with Broward when he went into Russia. That was a Rockefeller, Warburg. Today you would know it as BlackRock and State Street. But
exactly.
But the movement into Russia in the 1990s by the industrialists trying to buy up everything was backed by Warburg and Schiff at the behest of the Rockefellers, Chase Manhattan, Morgan, whatever bank Lehman Brothers, whatever bank you want to refer to. They're all part of the same syndicate. But
correct.
It was an attempt to do exactly what they've just done in Ukraine. BlackRock has gone in there, made I'll make you some loans, but what they don't understand is if they take the loans, which I think they do understand at this point, they're going to be giving up their land and their resources to the conglomerate, to the syndicate. Now, the other thing I want to point out about Putin taking over and throwing these international conglomerates and bankers out is he has a very unique way of doing it. People fly out of windows. So if you have seen over the last decade all these business magnates being thrown out of windows at random in different parts of the world that were Russian, the reason why is because they have been directly connected to Broward's attempt to take over Russian industry and take over Russian resources. That being said,
However, he does not have a 100% hold on that technique, as we're going to find out when we go through Operation Gladio. They throw a lot of people out of the windows too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So it seems to be a suicide of choice, like with Forrestal.
Unfortunately, you know, and I hate to say this, folks, we've talked about Forrestal on my other shows with Jonah. So if you haven't heard, Forrestal was a true patriot. And unfortunately for him, it resulted in a high velocity impact to the ground.
So I want to say this in my research. I think he initially, because of positions that he had been in, knew about Gladio. I think there came a time when he decided that it was too evil and pushed back against it, which resulted in his high velocity impact.
Well, and, you know, unfortunately, Eisenhower had his car accident too, you know.
No, Patton did.
Patton. What did I say? Eisenhower. Eisenhower's the one that gave us the warning. But yeah, Patton.
Well, Eisenhower's the one that gave us Gladio.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so Patton, interesting that you bring up Patton, because that definitely had the stink of Gladio on it, because he died with Gladio operators operating in that theater all around him.
Yes.
And car wrecks are one of the favorite operational plans effected by Gladio operators. It happened in Turkey. It happened in France. It happened to de Gaulle several times. It happened to Aldo Moro in Italy. So what happened to Patton is, and what you're going to find when we talk extensively about specific Gladio operations, they have about 15 binders in their what we call a CAT, Combat Action Team facility. They have about 15 binders. And if you need to kill somebody, you pull one of those binders off, and that's how you're going to do it. Whether it's a head of state or a senior military officer, they really are not all that inventive.
No.
Throwing people out of the windows, one. And they just pick one of those binders and say, okay, here, go do this. And car wrecks is one of them. Plane crashes is another. But Patton, there is in one of these books, and I'd have to go back and figure out which one that I've read, was, I think it's the Nazi International book by Joseph Farrell, that talks about him. So you've heard of the Bell Project?
Yes.
In that the Germans were working on during World War II. The Bell Project was supposedly held in a Czechoslovakian, highly classified location. Patton was on his way there when he had his automobile accident. The intel was that he had gotten word of that and did not want it making its way out of the German AOR, and was going to secure it when he was killed. And the fact that that is the case makes you understand the international syndicate capability in working with what they present to us as enemies. Because what you're going to find, and I'll give you an example. This is a perfect time to enter this. So there was a lot of communication between Churchill and Hitler. Most people do not know that. And the Milford family, Milford, was critical to that communication. There were 5 girls, one of which married that Oswald guy that was responsible for the Balfour Agreement, the Round Table, blah, 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 the whole fascist / Marxist, whatever you want to call it, movement in England that Churchill and Churchill's son and Roosevelt's son was all involved in. So these Milford girls, one of which moves permanently to Germany and becomes Hitler's girlfriend. She's not talked about all that often. when Germany declares war on England, she shoots herself because she's very committed to England, but also very committed to Hitler, and that was just too much for her to handle. So she's basically permanently damaged for the rest of her life and eventually dies. But her sister that married the Oswald guy from the Round Table, she travels back and forth under the guise of visiting her sister as a messenger between Churchill and Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of connections between Churchill and Hitler to make me all question how much of that enemy status was not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just put that out there because now that I know about Gladio, I question everything.
Well, World War II is a very unique situation where you can actually see that everybody was funded by the exact same people.
Correct.
And these people happen to be part of the International Round Table. That in and of itself, people will roll their eyes. But when you have the exact same banks, the exact same individuals within those banks, and the exact same individuals that came out of World War I pushing towards a global syndicated, global totalitarian state, whatever word you want to use, when these exact same individuals and organizations financed all sides and set up all sides in the war and continue to communicate, and very good example, Ford was having parts made in Germany during the war. It makes it very obvious that something about the whole theater of World War II was not legitimate.
And even when they weren't making them in Germany, they moved that factory to France while it was under German occupation and continued to produce them there. So it was all just a big fake, if you will.
A lot of people died. There was a lot of misery. And if you look at Dresden in the aftermath of World War II and the atrocities that occurred on all sides.
But that goes to the whole terror thing.
Exactly.
So if you're building up to not have to do world wars, don't you want to make the World War II the worst one ever?
Exactly.
So if I can make World War II the worst world war ever, and then I hold that over everybody's head for the rest of time to say, you really don't want to do that again, do you? You better listen to us, because if you don't listen to us, we're going to have to do that to you again.
Yes, and that is the basic essence of Gladio.
Correct. So, and I believe that's why they dropped the nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon being dropped as the explanation point at the end of World War II was to stress psychologically to everyone, you really don't want to piss us off.
Well, and unfortunately for us, the psychopathy of these individuals, if they could not get to, I relate them to like a 4 or 5 year old kid who has to share his truck. He would rather destroy the truck than share it. And that is, unfortunately for us, the psychopathy that we have seen since World War I amongst these individuals.
If you equip that 5-year-old with a gun.
Yes. And nuclear weapons.
And nuclear weapons. Yeah. Good analogy, because that's about the way they work. So, anyway, we've got now the foundation of the communism, and let me also point out their continuum, because they do this a lot. So we left World War II with the supposed communist efforts on what we were told was the left, and Nazism, what we were told was going to be on the right. Well, if you chart those people by government control, both Nazism and communism are on the far left, and the only thing on the far right of that chart is anarchy. So on a continuum of government control, anarchy is on the right. A republic is a little farther in, but with a very small government just short of anarchy. You have democracy somewhere in the middle, and you have Nazism and communism and totalitarianism and every other thing that they created on the far extreme left. But again, this is about wordplay. This is about them controlling our psychology, and that's the reason why they come up with parties, the right and the left. Why would you call Republicans and Democrats right and left? Why would you do that? Because they psychologically wanted to affiliate that with Nazism and communism on the right and left. This is all on purpose. You have to throw all of that language out. You have to stop using their words. I don't refer to anybody on the right and left. I don't refer to anybody in parties. That's all bullshit for mind control. Throw it all out.
Well, that meme that's been going around, you have to learn to unlearn and relearn.
That's exactly right.
But the problem that we have is and since you brought it up, folks, if you have not noticed the trend, it used to be that you had a republic. Then they moved more to the center and they created a democracy, which is mob rule, by the way. And unfortunately for us, the syndicate happens to be the mob. And then what they have done since the Reagan era specifically, but more so since the assassination of Kennedy, is they have been moving Western politics, not just the United States, but since Kennedy's time, Western economy and Western government has been gradually moved further and further and further into what you would call the totalitarian government style, which would be communism or fascism. And fascism really is a combination of the state and the corporations. And that's the reason why we use corporatists, because it's a combination of state and corporations controlling everything.
Which totalitarianism was a lot like that as well.
Yes. I mean, corporativismo in Italy was exactly what they're pushing for.
Yes.
So, I mean, that particular stance, but what people need to understand is that specifically since World War II, but more so since Kennedy's assassination, all Western governments, including Australia, and I hate to say it, folks, even in India, you'll see it, they have been pushing further and further and further to that totalitarian communist style, corporatist style of government. And it is these Gladio programs that are allowing this, order out of chaos. It's pretty obvious.
Right. So as we leave World War II, we have, and I make the argument that we did not win World War II. Around 1942, they collectively decided, and I'm not ruling out the Allies, they, maybe the International Syndicate, collectively decided to change operational and tactical level operations, not the strategic takeover of the world, because that's the strategy objective. They changed operational and tactical level objectives to transition from a visible war to a covert war. And as you leave World War II with the Gladio stay-behind units embedded in all of the Axis, you have a meeting between General Galen and Alan Dulles, who was the European OSS guy at the time.
Yes.
Alan Dulles and General Galen, and let me also just back up just a second. So in 1942, General Wolfe, with Otto Sikorsky and several others, created the Gladio stay-behind units for Hitler's use. They were originally called werewolf units. Yes. They were named basically after General Wolfe, but because they were citizen by day and killer by night. That was their mission. So they, throughout the Axis territory, set up stashes of weapons, communication gear, money, and explosives. Those were the four primary things buried. They focused on burying these in public land.
Yes.
We are going to eventually cover the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, which was another international syndicate to go in and buy up these nature preserves for the purpose of using them for Gladio operations. But I just want to put that out for future discussion. Right now, it's important to understand that these were basically put inside of national parks. And because you can control access, because you can shut them down because you own them, and most of them were done in areas less transited by people in general, off trails and stuff like that, that would be less likely to be found. They were primarily units of about 20 people, 15 to 20. The two people in charge were the only ones that the Galen and Sikorsky network knew. They did not know who the actual trench soldier was. And only the two people in charge of that particular Gladio unit knew who his underlings were. It was very decentralized. They were given a mission. They fell in on their stay behind stash. They got their stuff out. They did whatever the objective was, blow up a bank, do whatever. And they returned, buried the stuff, and went back to their normal life. They did this only at night.
Yes.
So that's in 1942 when this starts. I'm also going to point out that in 1942, the Vatican Bank was established. And we'll find out the correlation to that in the aftermath of as we go on through Gladio. But that's an important time.
Well, and the other thing to bring up, too, is at the same time the Vatican Bank was established, they were already outlining and detailing the establishment of the World Bank in Germany at the end of the war. So
yes. Okay, so now we've got that correlation. So now you have Galen, who was responsible for the werewolf units, meeting with Allen Dulles. And Galen buys his freedom in the aftermath of World War II by divulging to Dulles where all of these Gladio operations are, and offers up Sikorsky to continue managing the program in the European theaters. So now, folks,
before she goes any further, you've heard me talk about Galen in some of my occulted history, like I did one that's who won World War II. That is very specific about this situation. Now, what you need to understand about Galen is Galen had two different networks that he was using. He had the German spy network, but he also had the Jesuit spy network. They were completely interchangeable at that point. So his connection to Dulles and continuing to operate within the OSS, which ended up being the CIA, you need to understand that this is a continuum. It's not a severing. It's a continuum of an operation that had already existed for a very long time. That being said,
yeah, that's the reason why I bring up the Vatican Bank, because they are not separate.
No.
Yeah. So also it is William Colby, as I mentioned to you before we began, that made the comment that the Vatican has the most elaborate spy network in the entire world, and no other intelligence agency will ever come close.
No.
He said that out of deference to the Vatican, because through the hierarchy of the archbishops, as you mentioned in confession, there's no better source of information than the Vatican Church.
Exactly.
And you can just take that for whatever you want. And I will also just kind of take a time out here. One of the things I should have said at the beginning when I was talking about the different religious aspects, on a personal note, when we provide information like this, we understand that there are people that are deeply committed to their faith, and I don't say these things lightly. I had 3 of my best researchers that was helping me do my book reviews leave our channel because they're Catholics, and they did not like the exposure to the Vatican Bank. And all I have to say to people like that is kiss my grits. My entire world got blown up. I 30 years on active duty in the service of the United States military, and Operation Gladio destroyed every safety tenet that I had of what I thought I did. So no one leaves this fight without pee in the rice bowl. So,
well, you know, folks, what I want to emphasize is we have people within the Catholic, the Christian, the Judean, and unfortunately even the Zionists, even though they've been manipulated in ways that are different, and the Muslim. We have people in all of these religions that have sincere belief and they are doing what they feel, not being part of this manipulative backdoor. It's the difference between clergy and laity, you all. You have the laity, who are all the people who follow the religion. And then you have the clergy, which is that esoteric group in the middle. And not even all of them are part of these organizations. They are serving the organization, maybe even blindly. But it's that esoteric group in the middle, that small group within that small group. And that's the reason why they've always differentiated between clergy and laity. Clergy are on the inside, laity are on the outside. And it's the same with all the religions. So I want to be very specific that we don't target the religions. What we're targeting is that syndicate within the religion that actually controls things.
Okay. So back to the story. So we've got Galen and Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles dresses Galen up as a 4-star U.S. general. He brings him to the United States to debrief and get all of the specifics about this Gladio network. They then go to work on creating a Gladio network plan for all of the allied countries that, in the standing up of NATO, is going to take command and control of the Gladio network upon itself. So you have, and I want to foot stomp this, Galen goes on to head BND, which is the German version of the CIA.
Yes.
He works in the first West German administration as the chief of intel, which is the exact same job he had for Hitler.
Yes.
So there is no difference in West Germany and Hitler's Germany.
No.
Chancellor Adenauer was basically a Nazi during the time, although he never joined the Nazi party and had the number, he was able to, but if you follow his connections and his family connections, you will find out that he very much was in favor, and he was responsible for every single one of the former Nazis, the SS, every one of them. They all got their school teaching jobs back. They basically reinstituted Hitler's Youth. They basically went back to every facet. And that's why I say we did not win World War II.
No.
West Germany was a recreation of Hitler's Germany, in large part with the same people. I want to foot stomp that. Because in the first couple of years, only the hierarchy got reinstituted, but within the first 10 years, they were all back to work.
Yes.
And they embedded them. They took the ones that they couldn't infiltrate into the West Germany administration, and they put them in England, they put them in America, and I'm talking about the scientists, I'm talking about military officers, they put them in Gladio, like Sikorsky. They were in bed. So literally you took Hitler's administration and battered them worldwide. So you tell me that Hitler lost, or Germany lost World War II, I'm going to call you a fool if you think that.
Yeah. Folks, I also have to point out that during Korea and Vietnam, we had a group called the Special Operations Group. And if you want to know how the Special Operations Group became what it became, it's because the Special Operations Group was originally established and was headed by Nazis that were brought over here at the end of World War II. That's the reason why it was so effective. That's the reason why they were so good at what they did. And by the way, it's the reason why they broke every international war agreement and pact that we had.
You will find that Otto Sikorsky was behind a lot of that.
Oh yeah, well, you know, we got in Cambodia we had Air America. That was a Gladio operation. During Korea we had the bombing campaigns up north that were part of the Operation Gladio. But what I wanted people to understand is it was an immediate effect of bringing them into our military, not just into our science and our schools. They were brought into the military, and those special operations groups that were established during Korea were Nazis.
And most people don't get the timeline either.
Yes.
There was a couple of years between the end of World War II and Korea.
Mm-hmm.
We never demobilized.
No.
The syndicate was on this war footing that never ended. We went from Korea to Vietnam. You also have to understand, and I'll add a little bit to that when we get to that part about Korea, because it's critically important for you to understand the continuity of operations of this entire effort.
Yes.
They never demobilized from World War II. It was a continued effort. They just changed tactics.
Exactly. Now, folks, I interrupted her. We're going to go back and talk about Galen coming to the United States. But I wanted to emphasize that these units that we're speaking of were immediately embedded as officers and non-coms in the United States military. And that is very important to understand.
So, speaking on that, we get to Sikorsky's Nuremberg trials. Now, let me also say that for all of you people that post, we want Nuremberg 2.0, please stop that. Because you don't know anything about Nuremberg if you post that. Nuremberg was a joke.
It was.
And Nuremberg took a few people who were not key people and hung them. Everybody that was key were left alive. The guy that was running Nuremberg happened to be a Dallas attorney who will show up later in the JFK assassination.
Exactly.
Okay. There are lots of ties to Nuremberg from Dallas.
Including Dulles.
Including Dulles. So when Sikorsky has his trial, it is a British SOE officer, which is basically their CIA at the time, that testifies in his trial that gets him acquitted.
Yes.
All right. So they save Sikorsky. After his trial, they move him to a camp, and I'm going to forget the name of it. I'll find it in a second. They move him to a particular camp. Hold on. And in that camp, he is basically given his new mission in operating the beginnings of Operation Gladio out of NATO. And he is going to begin working. He eventually moves. He goes to France for a little bit, and then he goes to Spain. And at the time, it was Franco Spain, which means it was a fascist, socialist type country, which was the perfect, because they were quote unquote neutral, you know. But you could operate and do some really bad things in Spain because the guy that was in charge was doing some really bad things. But Camp King, King, is the camp that they took Sikorsky to. And Camp King basically was the collection of all of the German officials that had been part of the Werewolf, basically redesigning them into Gladio operations. So we then have the stand-up of NATO, and NATO, as I pointed out to you, has the compass rose. There was a couple of entities inside of NATO, and we can talk a little bit more about that in our next video. I'll have the actual names of the two entities that they stood up inside of NATO as the command authority for all European Operation Gladio efforts.
Yes.
And that was in the 1948-49 time frame. So they also established an agreement. It was a secret agreement that Paul Williams, in his book called Operation Gladio, talks about, that all nations that joined NATO had to sign, saying that they would set up Operation Gladio networks inside of their country.
Exactly.
Now, supposedly, this is where the anti-communist thing. So in 1946-47, Stalin is an ally, right?
Yes.
All right. So millions upon millions of Russians died between World War I and World War II in the effort of supposedly, quote unquote, winning. And within not even a day, the communists become mortal enemies.
Yes.
Because it started even before Nazi Germany folded, where the OSS is going around preserving Nazi capability in collusion with the Nazis. And Alan Dulles actually is quoted as saying, "We never fought the right enemy. The enemy always was the Soviets."
Yeah. And Eisenhower kind of made that, and Patton especially made that.
All of them did.
But it's just just to review this just a tiny bit, folks. I have said it before, and I know I got his name wrong. There was two major things that happened, but the first one was in 1954. We had a Nazi SS officer who was in command of NATO. So that's something to make sure that I point out. I'll look up the name. For some reason, it slipped my mind.
I don't know that he was a command. I think because NATO has always been under the military command of the U.S., but they had the civilian guy that supposedly is just kind of like our DOD is set up, where you have the civilian secretary. The secretary for like the first 16 of the first 20 years were Nazis.
Yes, there you go. That's what I was trying to point out.
Yeah.
And he was the secretary of NATO. And we also had the same thing with the Secretary of the United Nations. So it's an obvious thing. It's not like you can't look them up.
Correct. Yeah. They literally just distributed them from going to, and that's why I say, and I use those words specifically, we went from an overt total war on humanity to a covert war.
Yes.
And World War II marks the demarcation of those two operational and tactical shifts, because the strategy, the strategic goal, has always been the same.
Well, the other is we're at about an hour and 10 minutes, and I've had you almost tied up for 2 hours this morning at this point. But I think it's very important to point out that we can go all the way back. Literally, we can go all the way back to Phoenicia and the Canaanites, and their insertion into the Venetians and Carthaginians, the Carthaginians. This goal is not anything new. It has just spread out, and it has adapted, and it has changed names over time. The Holy Roman Empire is no different than what we're dealing with today. It's just a different name with the same basic system in place, you all. Between the usury banking and the spy network, we have exactly the same problem that we've had since the years of Justinian, and that was in Constantinople. So to think that this is something new is to not understand history.
And that's why I think it's so important that we start using real words and not their words.
Exactly.
If you call what's happening right now color revolutions, you completely dismiss the Operation Gladio aspect of color revolutions. They just changed the name. Stop using their names.
Well, and Gladio being, good Lord, we're at almost a century. We are pretty close to a century. Give it another couple of years. Folks do not understand that this has been an ongoing operation for almost 100 years, and that should worry. That should worry people.
Yes.
And Colonel, I have to tell you, I served 18 and a half years doing probably one of the most thankless jobs and most dangerous jobs that I could have chosen to do. And having discovered the things that I discovered on the ground overseas, coming back home and trying to act like I was loyal to what I knew was happening was very, very difficult. But when you choose a career and you know that you have to do this for an extended period of time in order to get your time in, I was able, because of my situation, to adjust and do what I did rather than what I was necessarily ordered to do. I hate to say that out loud, but NDAs are over, folks. So being on the ground in different continents, dealing with different situations that our own government through Gladio was creating, I was able to do my job because it still protected the greater number of people, and I had that luxury. but 20 years in arrears, almost 30 at this point. I look back and I'm like, most of the problems that I was sent out to solve were being created by Gladio groups.
Correct.
And that is disgusting.
And I will tell you from my perspective, because a lot of people don't understand, how can you be a colonel and not know these things? And I think it's worth saying, and I know plenty of people that were operational. It is not a operational versus a support officer, although I was a support officer. When you're a pilot in the United States Air Force and you eventually attain the rank of colonel, you have spent, and I'll just use several of my friends that were fighter pilots, you go drop bombs. That's what you do. You are the best at doing what you do. You don't understand the good guy versus bad guy because you have intelligence that supposedly is vetted intelligence, identifying the good guy and the bad guy. If you're an intelligence officer trying to decide the good guy and bad guy, you are given information from CIA assets. And it is that information that you are vetting. If you're a support officer, and the time that I've spent all over the world, I was at U.S. Central Command over 9/11. I saw from the inside exactly how you transition to a war footing. I can tell you unequivocally that you are fed information. Did the 4-star general? I don't know. The information, even in my intel buddies that were captains and majors at the time that were doing the battle assessments and that type of thing, every single thing you do is stovepiped. You only do what you are tasked to do. You don't have time because you are wrung out working 18 hours a day in the middle of what is going on to rise to the 30,000-foot look, because that's not what you're paid to do. You are paid to do your job in your silo, and because of classification, everything is compartmentalized. And so it is not until you get out of that hamster wheel that you start reading and cross-utilizing all of the different sources of information, both foreign and domestic, that you can create a complete picture. And then what I've had to do is go back and timestamp where I was when these things were happening and what my personal experience can add to the discovery. And what I found out, and obviously just kind of crazy, is how often I was sitting right next to something happening and didn't even know it.
Yes.
But now I can add my personal experience to the revelation of what was happening it's almost like God placed me in particular places so I can see the effects and attest to them today without ever even knowing what I was looking at when I was watching it. Because I don't know if I could have seen if I could have interpreted then what I know now and why it was happening. I don't know that I could have stayed in. So there was obviously a purpose.
For me, I had the luxury, and folks, don't get mad at me. I am still 101 second to none. Always will be. But I left the Air Force to go to a private group. First of all, rules of engagement were much better for us as far as survivability. Our latitude in operations was a much cleaner, much easier to do. My survivability, obviously 18 and a half years, says something. But the fact of the matter is all that time I was busy doing what I was told to do. You need to retrieve this or you need to destroy this. You cannot leave it.
Exactly.
You need to eliminate this personnel that has this and retrieve it, or you need to eliminate it, period, whichever way it has to be done. We had latitude that we wouldn't have had if I'd have been regular USAF. Okay.
But you just assume that your government is on the up and up.
And then, you come out, I came out in 2002 with a severe injury, and I started talking to friends who had been snake eaters, who had been in Vietnam, had been SOG, and started finding out what I was actually dealing with. And first thing, I was horrified. Second thing, I was shocked. And the third thing is I was so dejected. People don't understand this about me. And when I realized what I had been party to,
yes,
I was cleaning up messes that they didn't want to clean up.
Correct.
So they were basically, you know, they created these groups and they paid us well, but they were using us to clean up things that they had created because
Correct.
they didn't want their fingers connected to it.
So what's interesting about what you're saying is so important, and I say this so many times when I go out and give speeches, is people seem genuinely puzzled why we have such a high suicide rate in the military and in our veterans. Well, I can tell you firsthand that given the availability of information today, you and I are just two of millions of people that are finding out what we were actually part of and what we actually did. If you are not founded in a good place, I'm a diehard Christian. I believe in God. I believe that I have a purpose, and I try every day to maximize whatever that purpose is. But if you don't have that foundation and you take the available information that is now out there and you start researching it, you experience exactly what you and I have experienced, but you have no way of processing it. And for some people, unfortunately, that leads to suicide. And I don't think that the suicide rate among veterans and our active duty forces is astonishing. I think it is a direct result of the lack of moral authority that has gone on for decades, as you indicate, almost a century, within our government, and connecting the military to these types of operation unbeknownst to the people.
Now, I have another question for you. And folks, we are going to get together and we're going to try to do 2 or 3 more segments, I hope, so that we can get into the details post-World War II, post-1942. But I do have another question for you. For me,
Sure.
I have resolved myself to being a transistor in the middle of a circuit. I am relaying as much information as I can
That's a great analogy.
in order to, well, I thought you would appreciate that, but I am trying to convey and relate and record and document as much information about all these things, even the occulted history and the esoteric and the true occult that is involved in these groups. Because I think I can stop it at this point. I'm a realist. I can see what's going on around me, and the brainwashing technology that they have been using since 1984 with the television and the radio. I do not see that we can shake 50 or 60% of the population out of their stupor, and which is what we need before they are able to do what they're doing with the CBDCs and the banking controls and all this other stuff. My goal for the last several years has been to document everything I possibly can and hope that it survives for the next opportunity. I don't know where you stand on that. I mean, I have faith in ways that being a traditional native, it doesn't quite fall into Christianity, although it's not that different. I think that a lot of us are here for the purpose of revelation. And if that is all we're here for, then that is our job.
Correct. So in all of this, I have been a glass half full, because I look at now what I know, and we will get to this probably in our last segment, but we will talk about things that has happened in the last 5 years that the exposure. So there was, and I'll just give you a cheat preview. There was a family in Italy that you will find out in probably segment number 2, because we'll cover Italy extensively. There is a family that in 2019 the family, by family I mean mafia,
Yes.
that encompassed about 350 to 400 operatives in this country of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2000, probably around the time Trump happened to take office, there was an operation that began that in the past, any effort to control Operation Gladio in Italy resulted in your elimination, whether
Yes.
you were a reporter, a prosecutor, a judge, a government official, period. You're going to die. And you're going to hear me say that a lot. You're
Yes.
going to die. And when I do my book reviews, as soon as I say something about, like the reporter, he wrote this, well, we all know he's going to die.
Yes.
Because I don't make light of it, but there's just so much of it. So
Yes.
this family, around 2017, they began building an extensive underground facility that was like about 5 football fields.
Mm-hmm.
In this facility, I mean, it's probably even bigger than that, but in this facility, they put jail cells, they put courtrooms, they put living quarters. They brought every judge, every defense attorney, everybody. They brought reporters in that was going to report on all of the proceedings, and they housed them there before the very first arrest.
Mm-hmm.
They took down in 48 hours this entire network.
Wow.
They put them in jail. They had for 2 years trials.
Mm-hmm.
In 2019, the entire operation was revealed. About 95% of them were found guilty.
Mm-hmm.
They are still serving very, very, very long prison sentences.
Yes.
And they were operating the drug. So one of the other things, and I probably should have started off with this, I have a circle diagram that goes from the Operation Gladio. You have to pay for all of the weapons and stuff like that, and this is probably a good way to conclude.
Yes.
So the way they pay for Operation Gladio is they traffic weapons, they traffic humans, and they traffic drugs.
Yes.
And the reason we go to war in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan is we chase poppy field production. And
Yes.
that poppy field production produces a lot of things. So, and the reason why you want to have an actual war is because you can siphon off weapons to sell on the black market, on the ships coming over. You return those ships full of opium. And you also can create refugees, which creates the human trafficking element of it. So you have in every operation the money laundering aspect. They have all of the fake banks, the Nugent Hand, the Castle Bank, Paul Helliwell was all in all of that. So you have this vicious circle. And of course, in order to do all of this and to keep it quiet, you have the blackmailing of every aspect of it. So the Epsteins of the world, Epstein is such a small spoke in this entire operation. He only did U.S. And some Mossad, if you will, blackmail. There's so many Epsteins around the world, it would knock your socks off if you realize how many.
I think that's the reason why they've tried to clean out parts of the Ukraine, is to clean up that operation.
And I'm not going to disagree with you on that. But if you understand the wagon wheel of how the whole thing operates, you have wars which produce refugees and weapons. You black market the weapons, you black market the people, you black market the drugs. Then you buy the Gladio infrastructure. You pay for wet works, which is assassinations, and then you go back to the. So it's a round circle that just keeps reinventing itself. And you can put this cycle anywhere. When they lost Cuba as a drug trafficking hub, they moved it to South. The whole Operation Condor was only created because they lost Cuba.
Yep. Folks, and that's something that I was going to bring up before we quit. What you need to understand is if you're younger, you can look at the Iran-Contra and the Sandinistas and the events in Ecuador, El Salvador, Bolivia, Belize, Honduras, the drugs and all that. And if you're younger, that might actually have an appeal to you more than the older stuff that we're talking about. But the important thing to very definitively to state here is that from World War II through Laos and Cambodia, Afghanistan, South America, Afghanistan and Pakistan, this is all about Gladio. This is all about money, drugs, and people, and establishing control sectors. So
exactly.
That being said, dear, we're at an hour and a half, and I appreciate your 2 hours of time that you've dedicated to me today. Folks, we will be back. Colonel Towner-Watkins, you can find her on, I call it Twix, but it used to be Twitter, and now it's X. So Twix, and I'll make sure her links are in here, and I'm also going to get her to give me her Rumble link so that you can get to her books, her book reviews.
Basically, we have a book club. We have pretty much the same people that come in every night. I post my schedule as a pinned thing on Truth Social and Twitter for what the next coming week's going to be. If it doesn't change, it's just going to be whatever it was last week. And we go chapter by chapter in all of these books. We've done several. I started on Truth Social under the group called #International Syndicate. My daughter's taking all of those book reviews and putting them out on my Substack. I will send you that link as well.
It's an excellent, by the way, folks. Substack is an amazing place if you're looking for information, because a lot of people that can't be posted on these big platforms because of issues, you will find them on Substack.
That's true.
Colonel, I appreciate your time, ma'am, and I am looking forward to the next opportunity we have to do a recording. Folks, all the links will be in the description. And we are just now getting started because we've only hit World War II, 1942. And that's
We're just getting started.
And that's when it really started.
That's correct.
All right, I'm going to quit recording.